Today I'd like to talk about HTML tables. And I say HTML because in the past I used to teach tables in Expression Web, and there's some value to that. We'll discuss it a little later on in the course. There'll be probably 1, maybe 2 hour discussion on Expression Web and what it does and what its benefits are. But this is probably the most valuable HTML skill you'll learn because it's something that's often used in the web programming class to generate lists. So just as a quick example here, if I go to my website, I generate a list of all the books that I've read, and that's a table. But look at all the rows. You think I typed each one of those rows? No, it's just coming out of a database, and this isn't a I'm going to say a big for loop. It's in a little for loop. This is 5 lines of code that generates this entire table. And if you don't understand the tags, etc., building this inside of a loop, getting your head around it is very complicated. So this is a very valuable skill, knowing the HTML version of tables. One of the things I do recommend, though, is if your table is fairly complex, is that you first draw it out on a little piece of paper, a cocktail napkin or something to give you an idea of what the table layout's going to look like. As an example, a little later in my notes, we're going to build, where are you? This table. All right. And it's got X number of rows and X number of columns, with some of them merged and some of them not merged. And if you have an idea what you want it to look like ahead of time, creating the HTML is a little simpler. At least there's a strategy to creating the HTML. So when I talk about planning, that's what I'm talking about. Now the one from my books read that we just saw, that one wasn't a whole lot of planning because I didn't need to know how many rows deep was it. I just needed to know how many columns do I need. Right. But there's a lot of flexibility in tables. Once upon a time, tables used to be used for page layout. If I want my picture in the upper right-hand corner of the screen and I want some other information on the left-hand corner of the screen, then I would design a table to hold my picture on the right-hand side of the screen and some other information on the left-hand side of the screen with 2 cells. Most of that tables for page design layout, that philosophy has gone away. That's not what tables are to be used for anymore. Tables are to be used for columns and rows of data. That's their primary purpose. Doesn't mean you can't use them for table layout. It's just not the typical use of it anymore. Now, if we want to create complicated web pages that aren't columns of data, we use divs, sections, floating images, floating tables, all kinds of stuff. We use combinations of other attributes to create complicated websites, not tables. But the first editions of my web page were a lot of tables. And there's still a lot of tables in my website. If we go back to, let's just go to my page here real quick. This is a table because it's got the course name and then another column. It's got the course number. This is another table, and these 2 tables are floating so that when I shrink the size of the screen, the other one tucks underneath. And this was done for some of you cell phone users because you got tired of scrolling over, but those are my other courses. Who cares about them anyways, right? What are you teaching right now is what you're most interested in. Table structure. The table structure itself, the table itself is surrounded by table tags. So it's kind of like the body tag, and then inside the body there's a bunch of other stuff. Inside the table tag, or the table tag surrounds the beginning and the end of the table. Within the table you have multiple rows, and within TR, table row tags, and then with each row you have table data, or cells, cell tags. There are also TH for table header tags. Those are typically defined first. Table headers are very similar to table cells, except they're automatically bold-faced and they're automatically centered. That's the only thing that's different. So a TH is automatically bold, automatically centered if that's what you're looking for. And that's pretty much it. You just put those things together in just the right way. Of course, it helps to indent properly to show ownership. And there's a whole lot more complexity to it than this, but that's a simple start. If you'd like to follow along, I have created a brand new, using my Notepad++ macro, a brand new HTML page, or you can go steal one of your current ones and fill things in. I'm going to save that as an HTML table. Let's put it on my desktop, and we'll call it tables.html. And with the .html should make it the right format. There we go. And just give it a quick example or title. And now inside body, and actually I should create a style here. I would normally put these styles external, but I think after the styles chapter, you've got a pretty good handle that anything I can do external, I can do internal. If I put them internal as an embedded style, then I can manipulate them quicker without having to switch back and forth between tabs. So I'm going to create a style tag here. Type equals text CSS. I hope that's right. And we'll use that for all of my table styles. Now, that doesn't mean I expect you to use an embedded style in your homework. Exactly the opposite. I think most of your styles should go external. I'm putting them in here for convenience, so as I'm experimenting with table styles, I can put them in the same document, not have to flop back and forth, remember to save 3 different documents when I refresh, all that kind of stuff. This is where it will display. I saved it on my desktop somewhere. Where did you go? There you are. Pop that in there, and there's my empty page, and we'll start putting stuff in there. Thought I gave it a title, but I didn't save it. Okay, so inside here, I'm picturing a table. Right now, I'm picturing it in my mind. I said you should probably lay things out. What I'm picturing is a table that is, I thought somewhere here it told me how big to make it. I guess not. 1, 2, 3 rows high, and each row has 2 cells in it, 2 columns. Notice there's no discussion of columns here. In your Microsoft Word, you build tables, they ask you how many columns do you want. In HTML, there are simply rows and cells within those rows. So here's my body tag. Is that big enough for you back there in the cheap seats? Yes? Okay. Some blank lines in there. By the way, I do this to push it up so you can see it better, but that's not a good idea. We found out a couple of years ago in my systems class that if you have blank lines at the end of a document, some web servers choke on that file. It was the only difference between the files that worked and the ones that didn't, was the blank lines at the end of the document. So be careful if you save your files this way. Obviously here on the desktop it's not going to make any difference, but my Fat Cow Linux server did not like blank lines at the end of a document. We took them out, everything was fine. Imagine debugging that one. What's causing your trouble? Blank lines at the end of a file. What? And I don't think that was a Google, that was a rebuild the page. What happened? It just struck me one day. All right, inside here I want to build a table. So I start with a table tag. And like most programs, like most HTML, if it's a 2-sided tag, I close it right away so I don't forget. Then in between, I can create 3 rows. I'm going to put those on separate lines. And you can, of course, copy and paste. And this happens quite a bit, by the way, when you're building tables. Now I'm going to undo those last 2 pastes because each one of my rows is going to be identical. It's going to have the same number of cells in it. So before I copy my row, I'm going to put the cells in. I'm going to put in a cell and say this is in column 1. The contents of the cell is where your text goes. The table itself does not have any contents. The row does not have any contents. All table contents is shown in a cell. So that's what a typical table row looks like. table row tag, table end tag, inside table cells. If this is very complicated data, then my TD tag splits, but often it's pretty simple text. And the TD is just tacked on the end. Now I can copy that row. And now I have a 3-row table. So what I normally do is get that picture in my mind and figure out how many columns do I need. The number of rows I can copy as many times as I need to, but when I'm looking at that table layout that I showed you of my schedule, right, I'd be counting the number of columns more than anything else, because I have designated the number of columns in my table by using cells. Every row in your table must have the same number of columns, otherwise you get some pretty bizarre results. I've seen people use that to their advantage, but I never have. If you have one row that's got 3 cells and another one that's got 2 cells, you're going to have one row that's longer, and then blank cells or empty boxes or empty space, weird stuff goes on in the other rows. So they should all have the same number of cell tags except for merged rows and columns, and we'll talk about that a little later. So what does that look like? Save it, come over here and display it. Okay, where's my borders? In HTML5, borders are off by default. So if I want borders, I have to designate that in the CSS. And we'll see that here in just a little bit. But before I go on, I'm going to change the first row to headers. So I'm changing all the TDs to THs so that we can see the difference. And instead of column 1, I'll call it header 1 and header 2. Saved it, refresh, and notice I thought those were supposed to be centered there. If I put the borders on here, we'll be able to see where the actual table is. The table itself is only as wide as it needs to be to hold every cell's data. Exception of that is if the table gets to be so wide that it spills over the edge of the page, then cells start wrapping and weird things happen, and tables can be very, very flexible. The height of the table is only as big as the number of rows in it. So there's no extra space. If I add a paragraph underneath this, given the normal paragraph spacing, it's just right underneath the table. So that's the basic structure. Headers, usually the TH tags are the first row in your table. There's no rule that says that. If you want stuff at the bottom of the table that's centered in bold, totals maybe, you could use TH tags for that. But again, the tags are supposed to imply some meaning, like TH is header. So if I wanted bold totals down at the bottom, why don't I just format those cells as bold instead of calling them THs? TH is supposed to designate some kind of content. I have seen THs used in the first column, where every cell's first column is THs. If I wanted a first column of H's, then I'd have to change this and this to THs, because that's the first column. Here's some other examples. Row 1, column 1. I put some other numbers in there. I also like to put comments in here to help keep track of which row is what. If you've got a very complicated table like the schedule that I'm going to see, we're going to put some comments in there to keep track of, I'm on the Monday column or the Tuesday row or the 8 o'clock row or whatever I'm working on, and designate those so that they're easy to find during maintenance. Here the dotted borders are not really there, they're just shown to show you where they would be. There used to be a caption, there still is, still is a caption that can be applied to your table. So inside my table I can apply a caption, call it whatever I want. And notice that's its own tag. And it sits at the top and it appears to be centered. So if you wanted to have a table and mark it as table number 1 or figure number 1, give it a caption, you can do whatever you want. If you want to reposition that caption, then you have to use a style. Okay. Somewhere down here it talks about captions, column widths, table rows. Where'd the captions go? There. Tables can include a caption either above or below. And we can center it or left align it, whatever you want. The default is top centered, but we can change that. There used to be an align equals position tag for the caption. You could say align equals bottom or align equals right. That's deprecated. We have to use styles now. I could create an external or embedded style, but this is only going to be applied to the caption, so I'm going to put it inside here. And I've already forgotten the syntax, so let me grab that one more time. It's caption dash side. And then either top or bottom. The default is top. You could designate it, but I'm going to move it to the bottom now. And now the Volker's table is over there. And then I could also say align it to the right side of my table. Again, I could create a name style and say that it's on the bottom, it's on the right, its font size is 10, it's italicized, and do all that stuff to it. All the other styles that you learned about in Unit 3 still apply to the text that's inside the table. What if you want the caption someplace else? This is really pretty good. It was hard before to get it aligned to the right. We could put it at the top and bottom. That was about all we had. This align thing here, this deprecated thing, was top and bottom. That was it. What if you wanted a line to the right, or line to the left? What I used to do is just put an extra row at the bottom of my table and put whatever I wanted in there and make that my table caption and take the borders off so it looks like it's hanging below. So you're not limited to the caption. You could also add another row to your table and stick your caption inside there. Each row should have the same number of cells. The cells are in each position are called columns. And then another thing that I will often do to get started is instead of putting header 1, header 2, column 1, column 2, is I'll put non-breaking spaces in here. And you'll see why in a little bit. If you don't have something in the cell, HTML will often do weird things with your table. There has to be something inside the cell. If you have a cell that you want to be empty, and put a non-breaking space in there. The column widths are determined by the largest entry. So now that I've made that wider, my table automatically stretches. Notice the text is left aligned. I can change that. I can push that over to here. But what you can't see still is the borders. But remember that the width of the column is designated by the widest cell in that column. Later on, we're going to learn how to set the column width manually. All I do is set it in column 1. When I set it, or in cell 1, when I set it in the first cell of the column, that sets the height of the rest. One of the ways I can tell if you're cheating and using Expression Web is when you set the column width of one cell in Expression Web, it does the entire column. All the cells in that column, it sets them to the same width. It's not necessary. Set 1, it'll work all the way down, particularly if you're making the columns wider than they necessarily are by default. By default, all the data fits. These are some other things you can experiment with if you wish. I have not had much luck with these. You can create a table head row with row tags inside. Row tags. Seems a little odd. That's a table header. These go to the top. If you have a really big table, you could have that table header repeating, like my table of books. Okay. But repeat on what? Every page? There's no such thing as pages. We can just scroll through my list of books for hours if that's how many books there are. So I haven't found much use for those. There's a table footer with a row inside that says this goes on the bottom of my table. Mostly used for content description and formatting. So I can say my T-foot tag has this format. It's italicized, Arial 16, or whatever I want it to be. And there's also, here's the body of my table. So it allows you to have different formatting. Maybe you want the header rows, 2 or 3 of them, to have a certain formatting. The footer, which has all my total rows in it, maybe subtotals and things formatted a certain way, and then the body. What's bizarre about this, though, is you have to designate them in this order. You would think that the footer tag goes underneath the body tag. No, not the way you define it. If you switch those around, it causes trouble. If you wish to experiment with those, you can. I don't use them. Have not used them. Okay, now the borders. As we can see, by default, the borders are off all the way around. In HTML, there are 2 kinds of borders. First, there's the table border itself. Around the outside border of the table, you can designate what you want. So that's a table style. So I think I'm just going to come up here and put it in my style tag. That's not right. We can do table, colon. Is it a colon? No, it's just curly brackets. And I can set my borders in here using the border tag. We can set them all at once, or we can set them individually. You can see here that Notepad++ is recommending maybe border bottom. There's a border right, there's a border left, there's a border top. Or you could simply say border and change them all. This changes all the borders to be the same. What's tricky here is there are 3 components to a border designation. There are border colors, and you can create 3D borders. That's where these are all deprecated, by the way. You can create certain things. These used to be done in the past to create 3D looking borders where one border was black and the other border was a lighter gray, and it gave it this 3D looking effect. Right? But all of these elements, if you see them in any of your research doing your assignments, those are deprecated. Don't use them. There are no attributes that control the border anymore. It's all done with style. The border itself is designated using 3 components. First of all, how many pixel wide do you want the border to be? What color do you want the border to be? And then what style? What many people will often do, and this is a common mistake, and they'll get mad and they'll get frustrated and they'll cuss at it, right, is they'll say, I want a 2-pixel border that's maroon, and they'll stop. The border style by default is none. So you now have a 2-pixel hidden maroon border. It's not what you wanted. Maybe it is, because maybe later on using JavaScript, you'll go through and say, you know what, make the border style for my table be solid instead of none. You can change that on the fly. So it can be done, it's just not often done. And most of the time it causes trouble. So why can't I see my border? So at the very least, you want to designate the border style. And there are solid, and there's none, and there's dashed, and a few others. You can look those up in the style guidance at W3C. But normally I just use solid. If I start with that, I will get a border around the outside of my table. I was in a meeting before class for an entire hour, so I didn't get a chance to try any of this, so I just said it. Let's see if it's true. Whew. It's true. Okay. Looks like it might even be 2 pixels, a little thicker. Right? Because I didn't designate how wide to make it. So it might be 2 pixels. It looks pretty wide to me. And again, notice where the caption is appearing. So now I can also, if I want to, designate its size, 1 pixel. Normally I use pixels when it comes to borders because that's all we normally measure with anyways. Save it, and let's see if it gets smaller. It definitely did. So the default size seemed to be about 2, maybe even 3. Let's see what it says.
So does it not matter where you use it?
That's what's bizarre. No, it doesn't. It's one of the few tags where you can list the different styles in different order because they're so different. There's a size, there's a color, and there's a type that don't overlap in any way. that you can list them and it seems to appear in any order. My notes even say that. I think the table margin was even bigger than that when it defaulted. So let's see what happens when I take it out one more time. See if it gets bigger. Yeah, it's at least 3, maybe 4. Doesn't matter, I don't think. If you're not happy with the default size, then change it. And most of my tables are just single pixel borders all the way around and all the way inside. I'm going to change it to red. And now I've got a red border around the outside. And I did that for a reason, because we'll be talking about cell borders here in just a second. So if you apply the border tag to the table, you're talking about the outside, around the edges border. You don't always need to do that, because if I put a border on every one of my cells, the top of the cell border would ultimately make the edges of the table as well. But if you wish, you can have the outside border of the table be one color and the inside border be a different color. We're going to get really creative with your tables. Again, I don't usually get that creative. One color, done. But that's me. I'm a boring kind of guy, at least when it comes to tables. Nah, in general. Okay, red. Dashed, dotted, and a couple others that you can look up. According to this, the default is 2 pixels. I don't think I would say that. I think, was it 3? Thank you. It seems you can list the items in any order. But the key is to remember the solid. You can list them in any order, but if you leave the solid out, now I should get a 1 pixel border, right? No, because the default is none. Questions? Now the inside borders are controlled using cells. And imagine in my book list that I showed you how many cells are in that table. And imagine how painful it would be for each one of the cell tags to designate that I want a 1 pixel border all the way around this cell for every single cell. We don't typically do it. Normally what you do is define a style for TDs that says the border is solid, 1 pixel, and let's make this one blue so I can tell which ones are inside and which ones are outside. So that's normally done with a style. You can, if you wish, for some reason, make one cell stand out, change its border colors, just for that one cell. And create really bizarre looking tables where every cell is a random color, and I've seen that exercise, and it's kind of like, why would I want my web page to look like that? It's good exercise. And I better close that. Maybe put it on 2 lines, make it a little easier to see. I prefer this style, honestly, because it's just easier to see that you haven't missed the beginning and the end, but it's up to you as long as you got it there. Save it, refresh. Hey. Whoa. What's happening there? This is the design. It's part of how tables are built. Every cell gets its own border, and there's even some spacing in between the cells. That's actually called the cell spacing. We get to control that. So if you don't want any, you can blend that. But notice there's also some spacing between the outside border and the cells inside. We can change that. I just wanted to show you, that's why I changed the color, so you can see where those borders really are. We can change that border spacing. That's this spacing. I can make it bigger. Okay? And I believe that's a table tag. Let me double check here. Table tag. The spacing, you cannot change the spacing between individual cells, but you can for the entire table. Cell spacing, I forget the name. Border spacing. And this should make my table a little bigger with more gap in between. And notice this gap is also included in that. If I then make the background color of my table yellow or something, then all this would show through with yellow. But what if I want to get rid of them altogether? I just want lines. Set it to 0. Now watch very carefully. Doesn't that look like it's thicker to you? It's because it is. There's two borders, one stacked on top of the other, with no spacing in between, but there's still a border for this cell up here and a border for that cell down there. Notice if you look carefully, you can see the blue and the red are right next to each other. I'm going to zoom that table in so we can see that a little bit. Just a little bit of a gap. Well, I don't want double width borders. Look, this one's lighter, this one looks darker. That's annoying. But again, it's by design. This is interesting. Yeah, where's my border for the headers?
You didn't define them.
I didn't define them. I only defined borders for TDs. So if I want to apply these to everybody, I can put a comma here and say, make this for everybody in my table, all the different kinds of cells, and there we go. Notice now how they double up again. But it was good to leave that out because you could see the single border on top of this cell. But now they're all doubled. It's got to be a way to tell HTML, you know what, I don't want double borders, just the word is collapse them. This is another style. Okay, we can set it to 0. Borders of both adjacent cells are next to each other, we saw that. If we don't want to, we get rid of it using a table style border collapse with a property value of collapse. So this is another table style. And now they're collapsed. No, I did it to the table, didn't I?
There's no red outline.
It went away.
Yeah. How does it determine what?
Guess what? If you do border collapse, you can't have a different outline color. Because the cells, pardon me?
Depends on the thicknesses.
Depends on the thickness, okay? So he says if I make this a 2 or a 3, its original color, we might see it. Oh, there you go. It was 1, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here, if it's 1, then it collapses and we just use the cells. If it's anything else, then it goes over. I did not know that.
It's bigger than the cell, so it overrides.
Guess so. But now they're all singular. The border spacing, according to my notes, doesn't make any sense if you say collapse them. If you had border spacing of 5 and say, I want them this far apart, collapsed, that doesn't make any sense. So all you really need is the border collapse. I have never messed with table spacing. Or with border spacing because I never have space between my cells. But that's been my applications. Maybe yours needs it. Don't know. Most of my tables don't even have a border. Because if I don't put a border there and I say every cell, including the headers, have a solid 1 pixel blue border, it's going to work its way all the way around. And if it looks like one of these is double, it's because I'm zoomed in. And the zoom can't always adjust to the fine sizes of the pixels. So this is typically how I define my tables if I want to see the borders. I won't have to see the borders. No rule. Right? Sometimes it makes it a little easier to read. Questions on borders? There's also a padding style. By the way, there used to be a padding attribute, cell padding, deprecated. We do this padding style is a cell style. We can have different padding in different cells. If we look at my table here, okay, the text is pretty close. Looks like there's a little bit of extra space on top, but on the left and right, there's very little spacing. And if I don't want them squished in those boxes quite so much, that's a cell padding function. That is a cell function or a cell attribute. Or is it just padding? And once again, I can designate in pixels, usually pixels, but you can use M's and a few other things. So if I wanted a 1M padding, I think that'll work. It's pretty big though, right? But I can do a half an M. That way, if the font size of the table of the page changes, my table padding around here will adjust as well. If you don't want it to adjust, you always want it to be the same, then you can say I want a 3-pixel padding. That 3 pixels is applied, because we didn't designate where, all the way around. And now I've got a little more space. Let's go to 10, see what that looks like. If you wish, the padding is like many of the other styles that you learned about in Unit 3. You can designate using one padding tag, the top, the right, the bottom, the left. So if I wanted my top padding to be a little less, that's the right padding. That's the bottom padding. That's the left. Seems like a strange order. No, it's clockwise. Start at the top, work your way around. And I wanted this one to be 10. And now I have a little more spacing on the edges than I do top and bottom. And just to prove it, let me make these 2 so that's even more obvious. And by the way, you can set them to 0. This spacing has stayed pretty constant, but the top and bottom is changing. So you can put 1 number here, or you can put 4 numbers here. I think I've also seen this, I haven't tried it. 2 numbers where the first is top and bottom, the second is left and right, or right and left. That often works. Now I've set the bottom and top to 0, I believe. That's as small as they can get. But notice it still worked. And if I make this 15 or 25, it'll do both sides. So that's a nice shortcut, but remember the top is first, top and bottom, left and right sides are second. I've also seen in some books where they put 3 numbers in here, and then what does it mean? And I don't even want to guess. That seems odd to me that you would put 3 numbers in there and then make the maintenance programmer think, is that top right, bottom left, or top bottom left right, or what? I don't even want to guess. Don't use 3. This makes sense to me. And so does this. Just 1 number. Again, the padding is how much space is there between your text and the edges of the cell. The cells stretch to accommodate as much as they can. Questions about padding? If you want, you can designate just 1. You can do the same thing with borders, by the way. I can say border top here is red. So all my cells have a red top border and a blue bottom border. If we did something goofy like that, what happens where they're collapsed? I don't even know. Got that one. Interesting.
You're making 2 pixels.
What if you put it before the border salad?
I think this one will override that one. Okay, so here the border top is only applying for some goofy reason to that top row. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Because
Because the bottom one,
the first one, whichever one was defined first is overwritten.
but why wouldn't it do the top of these then?
Because
the
the
blue,
blue, which was defined later, overrides the.
not anymore, it's not. I understand. Oops. Save this one, refresh the other one. It's not hard. Why didn't it do the top of all of them?
Because when it merged them, like you said, the blue, which is defined later,
Yeah.
overrides.
But if that's really what you want, then change this. Okay? And make this left and right. Or experiment with it. I kind of thought they'd all be red, but then this one is a bottom, that would be blue. I'd have to tweak that. And if I just want those borders to be, play with it, there's probably a way. Like I said, for the most part, this is what I do. Keep it simple. Cell padding deprecated. Table size. How big is the table? The table is only as big as its contents. Each column is only as wide as it needs to be to fit the widest piece of data in that column. Each row is only as tall as it needs to be to fit the widest data that it has, or the deepest data that it has. Add some padding. But if you wish, you can set a width. 80% says this table should be 80% the width of the screen. Leave a 20% gap. What happens to the columns? They adjust. What's bizarre is how they adjust. That's not what I want. Why is that one column? Because it has a lot longer data in it, but notice how as you get to, there's a limit to how small you can make these things, the window. Right, but as I get smaller, this wraps, this keeps shrinking and wraps. But for some reason, this column is always narrower than that column because of the text that's in it. What if I don't want that? Then you mess with the table some more, actually with the cells. Okay, so here's the width, percent. You could specify pixels if you want it to be exactly one size. Probably a last resort. Used to be able to specify height and widths of tables as attributes, deprecated, and we rarely specify a table height. Why would you want a table to always be this size? It's pretty rare.
You get the scroll bar if you do.
And then if there's not enough room for everything you got in it, you got to scroll. Maybe that's what you want, because you want to shrink the size of the table. Definitely not to make it bigger. Why would you want empty space at the bottom of your table? We can float tables to the left and to the right, and I have a typo. This should be float right. Table goes to the right, text wraps on the left. So if I float my table, now it's going to jump to the right, and this text should come up. My table is 80% of the width, but it's floating, so text can wrap around it. And if I float it the other direction, it goes the other way. And if I don't specify the width, then the table still floats, but it's only as wide as it needs to be. So you can create some pretty interesting effects using floats, and that's kind of where I was going before about you used to use tables to make that kind of stuff happen. Now we don't do that anymore. We use floats and divs and sections, but that doesn't mean you can't put a table and images in here and wrap it all over the place. What's missing is a float center. No such thing. It's amazing how many HTML assignments I get that say float center on the table and think that's going to center it, and it doesn't. If you want to center the table, then you set its margins. And I think I've discovered that we can set the margins period to auto, and it'll set the top margin to whatever it needs to be automatically, the left margin or the bottom margin to whatever it needs to be automatically. It'll be interesting to see if this centers up and down. I don't think it will. but it will center the table left and right. Be right with you.
Okay.
Don't let me forget. Notice it didn't center it up and down. The margin at the top of the table and the bottom of the table auto just designates, give me a minimum amount of space like you normally would. But the left and right centers that table, so no matter how I make this window bigger, the table stays in the center, but not up and down. So instead of, in my notes it says do the left and right to auto, instead of that, just set the margin to auto. Same thing with your images. Unless you have some reason to change the margins on the top and bottom. Brandon?
Yeah, one thing I noticed when you do that and when you link an image,
Yeah.
it links the entire margin space as well.
Mean making it a link?
Yeah,
Is that what you
if
mean?
you make an image a link, it'll link the entire margin space if you do that to CSS.
Okay.
So
So then
around
so
that-
all of this has a border around it, or you can just click in the
You
empty
can just
spot?
click in there and it'll,
And it'll
link
go with
to
the image.
Picture, yeah.
Hmm.
I don't know if I did something wrong or what.
No, I don't think so. It sounds like it kind of makes sense because you're setting, well, that margin, did you apply it to the image? Yeah.
I believe so.
Yeah. If it's applied to the image and not a container around the image,
Yeah, maybe it's in the div tag. I don't think
if it's
so.
in the div
Oh,
tag, that
oh.
div covers the whole line, and then you can
Yeah.
text align your div and center the image that way.
I'm pretty sure it was an image.
Yeah, that might be,
I'll double check.
but that wouldn't be terrible. Click here and does the same thing as
Yeah,
clicking
it's
on the
just-
image.
A
little-
professional page though. It's
A little funky, yeah. Good point. Okay, so that's how I'd center the table. My table's not going to be a link, so I don't have that issue here. Though with images, it might cause problems. Okay, so there is no float center. This we just saw the shortcut for. What can we do to the table formatting? Anything you want to. But now where you apply the formatting controls how much of the table is affected. If I apply a font family style, for instance, to the table tag, it does every piece of text in that table, unless the text has an overriding row style, and then that row is applied, unless there's a cell in that row that has an overriding style. And so remember, we didn't talk about it much, but when we were talking about styles, if you apply a style to the body of your page, it applies to everything on that page. It propagates is the term that was hiding in my notes. I forgot to mention it. Any style that you apply to a container propagates to all the stuff that's inside. Many of you have found I think it's inherit tag, that says for this one, don't take a new style inherit its parent instead. But styles propagate unless you override them. So anything I do to the table applies to everything inside the table. Unless I apply it to an individual row. So maybe for my header, and I could do just, I could apply a name style to this and say this is my header row. And say you're 125%, everybody else is normal size. So all of those kind of things work anyways. Or that I could do the TH tags, right? And say they're bigger. I could do it that way. Or I could apply it to the row. I can do all kinds of stuff here. Let's say for some reason I want my bottom row to have a background color. Then I can come down here and say you are the bottom row. Is that what I called it? Forgot already. No, just bottom. All those techniques you learned can now be applied to these different tags. And if you apply them to a row, it applies to everything inside that row. Unless I wanted to come in here and say your background color is pink. And then it overrides, because the closer you are, the further in you are, the more it applies. It overrides the ones on the outside. Just like we've had an external tag, any embedded tags override it. Any inline styles override it. If I have a tag on my table, a style on my table, anything that's inside a row, any row styles override the table styles. Any cell styles override the row styles, and so on. Justin?
can you do conditional formatting, or is that done somewhere else?
That would probably have to be JavaScript. If there's conditional formatting, I don't know about it. But JavaScript, you can say if this condition occurs text-wise or whatever, because where's the condition come from? The browser, the size of the screen, boy, I haven't seen that, but I would say it would be in JavaScript. And you could in JavaScript say if the size of the screen is this small to change the font size. Questions about formatting? You can apply it to any of the tags. Some of these things, like the border collapse and the border styles, where you apply them makes a difference. But when it comes to the font sizes and the colors and all those other things that you messed with, all applies to either the row or the headings or the cells or name styles, or I wouldn't normally use ID styles, but you could. It's probably a good place for a break. Background color, we can do background images. And according to this, I'm supposed to change the height of my header row. Okay. So if I want to, I can come in here and set a style. Let's try 200%, see what happens. Lose my mouse, that's what happens. Nothing. 200% of what? All right, so that's not going to work. So let's set it to 100 pixels instead. And then I can do a vertical align if you haven't seen this. Vertical align, colon, bottom. By the way, if you want up and down, its default right now is middle. That's not center. It's another very common mistake. You have vertical align center. That's vertical up and down is middle. It's not center. Left and right is center. So I can make my header bigger for some goofy reason and move the text to the bottom. I've done that and then hide these borders. All right. So then I can come in here and say, you know what, you TH guys, I don't really want you to have a top border or bottom border or any border for that matter. So then I just take them back off of here because they were on here. Save it. And now my column headers sit at the top. They don't even look like they're part of the table, but they are. And that extra spacing that I have here keeps me off the top of the page. Could have done that with padding. I could have done that by just adding an extra blank paragraph above the table. There's lots of ways to skin these cats to make things happen. All right, we'll play with column widths a little bit more when we come back from break.